Hello. Well, this is all a bit odd. I'm downstairs. Horror Show is upstairs. She's left me unattended with the channel, so we'll see how that goes. Gatsby is roaming around somewhere, so that's quite fun. I will just make sure I can see the chat. Cool. So I won't be able to really do much if there are technical issues. So sing out in chat because proper Horror Show is upstairs, keeping an eye on everything. But yeah, welcome to a very cozy stream, hopefully, of some nice traditional ghost stories by quite a renowned ghost story writer, Montague Rhodes James. Partly to give plenty of people a time to kind of the opportunity to join the stream, and also just to help people learn a little bit more about who M.R. James was. I'm going to do a bit of an introduction, sort of 10 minutes or so of waffling, and then I'll get into the first of hopefully 2 stories that I'll read tonight. But I think it's probably worth giving a bit of a flavour of who M.R. James himself was, sort of as a man and as a thinker. I've lost my little notes. There we go. Very prepared, very professional. So M.R. James was born in 1862 in Kent. And by the time his ghost story readings became a Christmas ritual, Montague Rhodes James, old Etonian and Kingsman, Dean and Provost of King's College, Cambridge, future Vice-Chancellor of Cambridge University, and, in semi-retirement, Provost of Eton, was amongst the most distinguished scholars in the world. His prodigious body of work on manuscript catalogues, on biblical apocrypha and the writings of the Church Fathers, on ecclesiastical architecture, and on whatever else happened to capture his imagination, would continue unabated until his death, aged 73, in 1936. Very occasionally, to entertain himself and his friends, he also wrote ghost stories. Even more occasionally, these were collected together and published in slim volumes. Smooth. While his catalogues in particular remain indispensable to any serious scholar of medieval manuscripts and are very unlikely to be superseded, it may have come as a surprise to Monty James that it was to be for his ghost stories that he would be best remembered and most revered. So he was predominantly an academic. He was educated at Eton, which is kind of the country's sort of foremost public school, essentially, although that's probably going to cause a rivalry amongst hundreds of public school boys. But he was a very academic man, sort of lived within kind of academic institutions all his life, so public school and then Cambridge itself. But his childhood was spent on the Suffolk coast, and for anyone who is not English or hasn't been to that part of the British Isles, Suffolk is on the east coast of the UK. I'm now second guessing myself, but it is. And it's a very flat, kind of austere, bleak part of the country. Sorry, Suffolk. It has its own kind of wild beauty, but it is a very kind of flat place and sort of empty and hollow, and gives rise to a kind of quite bleak art in a way. There are lots of artists and musicians who come from there who sort of talk about that kind of effect that it has. So the East Anglian landscape was quite influential on James, and if you read other of his ghost stories, they often kind of feature people travelling in that area or visiting villages in that area. But I'd like to briefly discuss something about M.R. James as a thinker, an academic, and sort of his role within the world of Cambridge, where he spent most of his career. The author of this introduction, who edited this book, perhaps has his own perspective, so we might find ourselves disagreeing politely, and obviously that's fine. Because the author of this introduction says that M.R. James's extraordinary intellectual capacities were matched by a commensurate anti-intellectualism, which amounted at times to a genuine fear of ideas, a fear which his stories, with their consistent themes of the dangers of knowledge, reflect quite clearly. His father, Herbert James, advised exercising wholesome restraint against ill-regulated speculation, and this is the kind of advice which the young Monty seems to have taken to heart. So essentially, he's kind of seen as this very detached, sort of uncurious figure. So although he was, a widely renowned academic, putting together papers and catalogues and that kind of thing, there's a sort of anecdote of him telling off some students who are having a philosophical discussion by saying, "No thinking, gentlemen, please," and rapping on the table with his pipe. And I think it's interesting as well that M.R. James understood himself to be a Victorian, sometimes at sea in and often at odds with the modern world, which is a sentence that's possibly quite resonant for many people in Horror Show's audience. And kind of fascinatingly, talking about James's career going to Eton and then to King's College. King's College at the time that he went up had sort of previously been a closed corporation just for the university education of Etonians. And while recent reforms had brought it somewhat more in tune with the modern world, it remained perhaps the most conservative college in a notably conservative university. Arguably, how are the mighty fallen, because at the time I was at Cambridge, King's was definitely the most leftist college in a notably leftist university. So that is an interesting transition. But I thought, I'd just briefly, I know I'm rambling a bit, but I thought I'd kind of give a 10-minute introduction, and then we'll get into the ghost stories in case anyone's joined wondering if this is the most boring ghost story they've ever heard. It's not. But I think it's sort of useful to consider James's kind of attitude to the modern world, given that sort of sense of being at sea in it. Because across a long career as an increasingly influential academic and university administrator, apparently James seems to have opposed and attempted to block wherever he could every piece of progressive legislation and every really modern thinker that crossed his path, increasingly seeing and using Eton and King's as bulwarks against secular modernity. So amongst the thinkers that he put himself at loggerheads with were the great evolutionary biologist T.H. Huxley, the political philosopher and psychical researcher Henry Sidgwick, and various others. James found himself on a committee that was looking to produce a report around admitting women to full university membership, and James did his best to obstruct that process at every stage. Other people that he objected to are Aldous Huxley, James Joyce, whom he considered a charlatan and a prostituter of life and language, Lytton Strachey, Bertrand Russell, Radcliffe Hall, who wrote The Well of Loneliness and was a prominent lesbian and involved in an obscenity trial, and perhaps worst of all for James was John Maynard Keynes, who appears to have become something of a nemesis and who may have been one contributing factor to James's decision to leave King's. So I think that's hopefully sort of positioned him perhaps politically and intellectually. For you, he was opposed to the kind of modernising sort of secularisation of society, and from within the walls of the academic institutions in which he lived, kind of did his best to kind of, I suppose, push back and do what he could. And I think it's kind of useful knowing that sort of slightly conservative attitude, I think, is one of the things that many people consider accounts for the brilliance of his ghost stories. And I will read one final passage before we get into the main meat of the evening. The great effect and power of James's stories lies in their acts of exclusion, the ways in which they use scholarship, knowledge, institutions, the past, as a rearguard action to keep at bay progress, modernity, the shock of the new. They are straitened, narrow, austere, limited. And it is precisely this lack of expansiveness that makes James a great short story writer and the very greatest ghost story writer, as these limitations become narrative preoccupations, simultaneously obsessions and games. The ghost story tends to be a highly conventional, formalised, conservative form, governed by strict generic codes, which often themselves, as with James, reflect and articulate an ingrained social conservatism, an attempt to repulse the contemporary world, or to show the dire consequences of a lack of understanding of and due reverence for the past, its knowledge and traditions. These traditions, when violated or subjected to the materialist gaze of modernity, can wreak terrifying retribution. So, I'll have a quick sip of water. And then I'd like to set the scene for what many people, or many sort of contemporaries and friends of James would have experienced on Christmas Eve. And we'll get into the first story after I've read this little passage. The first story is going to be called Canon Alberic's Scrapbook, and it's the very first ghost story that he published, although he'd probably written and told others by this point. So this gives you a bit of a sense of what his friends and colleagues experienced. It is Christmas Eve in King's College, Cambridge, in the first decade of the 20th century. In the chapel, the finest, most beautiful, and most complete work of late Gothic Perpendicular architecture in England, the famous choir, made up of choral scholars from the college and schoolboy choristers from nearby King's College School, have sung the carol service, opening with a beautiful rendition of Once in Royal David City. Though the celebrated Festival of 9 Lessons and Carols, for which the choir is today best known, is not a tradition that will begin until 1918, when the college starts to heal itself after the devastation of the First World War, in which so many young Kingsmen lost their lives. The fellows and scholars then process to Hall for dinner and tankards of hot-spiced beer to ward off the cold and the dark. To close the evening, a select few, a very few, friends, colleagues, former students, retire to the provost's rooms, participants in an altogether more sinister Christmas ritual, but one intimately connected to the carols and the chapel. This is a dark Victorian Anglicanism, practised out there on the fens in the flat east of England, where the sky and the land seem part of one another, and where there is no horizon, far away from the concerns of the world. The provost thinks of his own childhood, not too far from here, a world of isolated country houses in the Italian style, of Martello towers, shingle beaches, Anglo-Saxon burial mounds, witches. Candles are lit, the provost disappears into his bedroom. The friends talk and drink their brandies or port a little nervously. Perhaps someone plays a few bars on the piano, but always hesitantly and never for long. At last, the provost returns, clutching a manuscript covered in a spidery, illegible handwriting that might almost be his private cipher, the ink still wet upon the final pages, and blows out all the candles but one. It is gone 11, nearer midnight, when the provost begins to read, his clear, confident voice cutting through the dim, flickering light of candle and fire. I have my port. I came prepared. For some reason I'm coughing, so I apologise. Canon Alberic's Scrapbook. St. Bertrand de Comminges is a decayed town on the spurs of the Pyrenees, not very far from Toulouse, and still nearer to Bagnères-de-Luchon. It was the site of a bishopric until the Revolution, and has a cathedral which is visited by a certain number of tourists. In the spring of 1883, an Englishman arrived at this old-world place. I can hardly dignify it with the name of city, for there are not 1,000 inhabitants. He was a Cambridge man who had come specially from Toulouse to see St. Bertrand's Church, and had left two friends, who were less keen archaeologists than himself, in their hotel at Toulouse, and had promised to join him on the following morning. Half an hour at the church would satisfy them, and all three could then pursue their journey in the direction of Auch. But our Englishman had come early on the day in question and proposed to himself to fill a notebook and to use several dozens of plates in the process of describing and photographing every corner of the wonderful church that dominates the little hill of Comminges. In order to carry out this design satisfactorily, it was necessary to monopolise the verger of the church for the day. The verger, or sacristan, I prefer the latter appellation, inaccurate as it may be, was accordingly sent for by the somewhat brusque lady who keeps the inn of the Chapeau Rouge, and when he came, the Englishman found him an unexpectedly interesting object of study. It was not in the personal appearance of the little, dry, wizened old man that the interest lay, for he was precisely like dozens of other church guardians in France, but in a curious, furtive, or rather hunted and oppressed air which he had. He was perpetually half-glancing behind him. The muscles of his back and shoulders seemed to be hunched in a continual nervous contraction, as if he were expecting every moment to find himself in the clutch of an enemy. The Englishman hardly knew whether to put him down as a man haunted by a fixed delusion, or as one oppressed by a guilty conscience, or as an unbearably henpecked husband. The probabilities, when reckoned up, certainly pointed to the last idea. But still, the impression conveyed was that of a more formidable persecutor even than a termagant wife. However, the Englishman, let us call him Dennis Toon, was soon too deep in his notebook and too busy with his camera to give more than an occasional glance to the sacristan. Whenever he did look at him, he found him at no great distance, either huddling himself back against the wall or crouching in one of the gorgeous stalls. Dennis Toon became rather fidgety after a time. Mingled suspicions that he was keeping the old man from his déjeuner, that he was regarded as likely to make away with St. Bertrand's ivory crozier, or with the dusty stuffed crocodile that hangs over the font, began to torment him. "Won't you go home?" he said at last. "I'm quite well able to finish my notes alone. You can lock me in if you like. I shall want at least 2 hours more here, and it must be cold for you, isn't it?" "Good heavens," said the little man, whom the suggestion seemed to throw into a state of unaccountable terror. "Such a thing cannot be thought of for a moment. Leave monsieur alone in the church? No, no. 2 hours, 3 hours, all will be the same to me. I have breakfasted. I am not at all cold, with many thanks to monsieur." "Very well, my little man," quoth Dennis Toon to himself. "You have been warned, and you must take the consequences." Before the expiration of the 2 hours, the stalls, the enormous dilapidated organ, the choir screen of Bishop John de Meulion, the remnants of glass and tapestry, and the objects in the treasure chamber had been well and truly examined, the sacristan still keeping at Dennis Toon's heels, and every now and then whipping round as if he had been stung, when one or other of the strange noises that trouble a large empty building fell on his ear. Curious noises they were sometimes. "Once," Dennis Toon said to me, "I could have sworn I heard a thin, metallic voice laughing high up in the tower. I darted an inquiring glance at my sacristan. He was white to the lips. 'It is he. That is... it is no one. The door is locked,' was all he said. And we looked at each other for a full minute. Another little incident puzzled Dennis Toon a good deal. He was examining a large dark picture that hangs behind the altar, one of a series illustrating the miracles of St. Bertrand. The composition of the picture is well nigh indecipherable, but there is a Latin legend below which runs thus: "Qualitur est Bertrandus liberavit hominem quem diabolus diu volebat strangulare." How St. Bertrand delivered a man whom the devil long sought to strangle. Dennis Toon was turning to the sacristan with a smile and a jocular remark of some sort upon his lips, but he was confounded to see the old man on his knees, gazing at the picture with the eye of a suppliant in agony, his hands tightly clasped and a rain of tears on his cheeks. Dennis Toon naturally pretended to have noticed nothing, but the question would not go away from him. Why should a daub of this kind affect anyone so strongly? He seemed to himself to be getting some sort of clue to the reason of the strange look that had been puzzling him all day. The man must be a monomaniac. But what was his monomania? It was nearly 5 o'clock. The short day was drawing in, and the church began to fill with shadows, while the curious noises, the muffled footfalls, and distant talking voices that had been perceptible all day, seemed, no doubt because of the fading light and consequently quickened sense of hearing, to become more frequent and insistent. The sacristan began for the first time to show signs of hurry and impatience. He heaved a sigh of relief when camera and notebook were finally packed up and stowed away, and hurriedly beckoned Dennis Toon to the western door of the church under the tower. It was time to ring the Angelus. A few pulls at the reluctant rope, and the great bell Bertrand high in the tower began to speak, and swung her voice up among the pines and down to the valleys, loud with mountain streams, calling the dwellers on those lonely hills to remember and repeat the salutation of the angel to her whom he called blessed among women. With that, a profound quiet seemed to fall for the first time that day upon the little town, and Dennis Toon and the sacristan went out of the church. On the doorstep, they fell into conversation. Monsieur seemed to interest himself in the old choir books in the sacristy. Undoubtedly. I was going to ask you if there were a library in the town. No, monsieur. Perhaps there used to be one belonging to the chapter, but it is now such a small place. Here came a strange pause of irresolution, as it seemed. Then, with a sort of plunge, he went on, "But if monsieur is amateur de vieux livres, I have at home something that might interest him. It is not 100 yards. At once, all Dennistoun's cherished dreams of finding priceless manuscripts in an untrodden corners of France flashed up, to die down again the next moment. It was probably a stupid missile of Plantin's printing about 1580. Where was the likelihood that a place so near Toulouse would not have been ransacked long ago by collectors? However, it would be foolish not to go. He would reproach himself ever after if he refused. So they set off. On the way, the curious irresolution and sudden determination of the sacristan recurred to Dennistoun, and he wondered in a shamefaced way whether he was being decoyed into some purlieu to be made away with as a supposed rich Englishman. He contrived, therefore, to begin talking with his guide, and to drag in a rather clumsy fashion, the fact that he expected 2 friends to join him early the next morning. To his surprise, the announcement seemed to relieve the sacristan at once of some of the anxiety that oppressed him. "Oh, that is well," he said quite brightly. "That is very well. Monsieur will travel in company with his friends. They will be always near him. It is a good thing to travel thus in company. Sometimes." The last word appeared to be added as an afterthought, and to bring with it a relapse into gloom for the poor little man. They were soon at the house, which was one rather larger than its neighbours, stone-built, with a shield carved over the door. The shield of Alberic de Meulion, a collateral descendant, Dennistoun tells me, of Bishop John de Meulion. This Alberic was a canon of Camange from 1680 to 1701. The upper windows of the mansion were boarded up, and the whole place bore, as does the rest of Camange, the aspect of decaying age. Arrived on his doorstep, the sacristan paused a moment. "Perhaps," he said, "perhaps after all monsieur has not the time?" "Not at all. Lots of time. Nothing to do till tomorrow. Let us see what it is you have got." The door was opened at this point, and a face looked out. A face far younger than the sacristan's, but bearing something of the same distressing look. Only here it seemed to be the mark, not so much of fear for personal safety, as of acute anxiety on behalf of another. Plainly, the owner of the face was the sacristan's daughter, and, but for the expression I have described, she was a handsome girl enough. She brightened up considerably on seeing her father accompanied by an able-bodied stranger. A few remarks passed between father and daughter, of which Dennistoun only caught these words, said by the sacristan. "He was laughing in the church," words which were answered only by a look of terror from the girl. But in another minute they were sitting in the sitting-room of the house, a small high chamber with a stone floor, full of moving shadows cast by a wood fire that flickered on a great hearth. Something of the character of an oratory was imparted to it by a tall crucifix, which reached almost to the ceiling on one side. The figure was painted of natural colours, the cross was black. Under this stood a chest of some age and solidity, and when a lamp had been brought and chairs set, the sacristan went to this chest and produced therefrom, with growing excitement and nervousness, as Dennistoun thought, a large book, wrapped in a white cloth, on which cloth a cross was rudely embroidered in red thread. Even before the wrapping had been removed, Dennistoun began to be interested by the size and shape of the volume. Too large for a missal, he thought, and not the shape of an antiphona. Perhaps it may be something good after all. The next moment the book was open, and Dennistoun felt that he had at last lit upon something better than good. Before him lay a large folio, bound perhaps late in the 17th century, with the arms of Canon Alberic de Meulion stamped in gold on the sides. There may have been 150 leaves of paper in the book, and on almost every one of them was fastened a leaf from an illuminated manuscript. Such a collection Dennistoun had hardly dreamed of in his wildest moments. Here were 10 leaves from a copy of Genesis, illustrated with pictures, which could not be later than AD 700. Further on was a complete set of pictures from a Psalter of English execution, of the very finest kind that the 13th century could produce, and, perhaps best of all, there were 20 leaves of uncial writing in Latin, which, as a few words seen here and there told him at once, must belong to some very early unknown patristic treatise. Could it possibly be a fragment of the copy of Papias on the words of our Lord, which was known to have existed as late as the 12th century at Nîmes? We now know that these leaves did contain a considerable fragment of that work, if not of that actual copy of it. In any case, his mind was made up. That book must return to Cambridge with him, even if he had to draw the whole of his balance from the bank and stay at St. Bertrand till the money came. He glanced up at the sacristan to see if his face yielded any hint that the book was for sale. The sacristan was pale, and his lips were working. "If monsieur will turn on to the end," he said. So monsieur turned on, meeting new treasures at every rise of a leaf, and at the end of the book he came upon 2 sheets of paper of much more recent date than anything he had yet seen, which puzzled him considerably. They must be contemporary, he decided, with the unprincipled Canon Alberic, who had doubtless plundered the chapter library of Saint Bertrand to form this priceless scrapbook. On the first of the paper sheets was a plan, carefully drawn and instantly recognisable by a person who knew the ground, of the south aisle and cloisters of St. Bertrand's. There were curious signs, looking like planetary symbols, and a few Hebrew words in the corners. And in the northwest angle of the cloister was a cross drawn in gold paint. Below the plan were some lines of writing in Latin, which ran thus: Responsa 12 Dec 1694. Interrogatum est. Inveniamne responsum est. Invenies. Fiamne dives. Fies. Vivamne in videndus. Vives. Moriane in lecto mea. Ita. Answers of the 12th of December 1694. It was asked, shall I find it? Answer, thou shalt. Shall I become rich? Thou wilt. Shall I live an object of envy? Thou wilt. Shall I die in my bed? Thou wilt. A good specimen of the treasure hunter's record. Quite reminds one of Mr. Minor Canon Quatermain in Old St. Paul's, was Dennis Doone's comment, and he turned the leaf. What he then saw impressed him, as he has often told me, more than he could have conceived any drawing or picture capable of impressing him. And though the drawing which he saw is no longer in existence, there is a photograph of it, which I possess, which fully bears out that statement. The picture in question was a sepia drawing at the end of the 17th century, representing, one would say at first sight, a biblical scene. For the architecture, the picture represented an interior, and the figures had that semi-classical flavour about them which the artists of 200 years ago thought appropriate to illustrations of the Bible. On the right was a king on his throne, the throne elevated on 12 steps, a canopy overhead, lions on either side. Evidently King Solomon. He was bending forward with outstretched sceptre, in attitude of command. His face expressed horror and disgust, yet there was in it also the mark of imperious will and confident power. The left half of the picture was the strangest, however. The interest plainly centred there. On the pavement before the throne were grouped 4 soldiers, surrounding a crouching figure, which must be described in a moment. A 5th soldier lay dead on the pavement, his neck distorted and his eyeballs starting from his head. The 4 surrounding guards were looking at the king. In their faces the sentiment of horror was intensified. They seemed, in fact, only restrained from flight by their implicit trust in their master. All this terror was plainly excited by the being that crouched in their midst. I entirely despair of conveying by any words the impression which this figure makes upon anyone who looks at it. I recollect once showing the photograph of the drawing to a lecturer on morphology, a person of, I was going to say, abnormally sane and unimaginative habits of mind. He absolutely refused to be alone for the rest of that evening, and he told me afterwards that for many nights he had not dared to put out his light before going to sleep. However, the main traits of the figure I can at least indicate. At first, you saw only a mass of coarse, matted black hair. Presently it was seen that this covered a body of fearful thinness, almost a skeleton, but with the muscles standing out like wires. The hands were of a dusky pallor, covered, like the body, with long, coarse hairs and hideously taloned. The eyes, touched in with a burning yellow, had intensely black pupils and were fixed upon the throned king with a look of beast-like hate. Imagine one of the awful bird-catching spiders of South America translated into human form and endowed with intelligence just less than human, and you will have some faint conception of the terror inspired by this appalling effigy. One remark is universally made by those to whom I have shown the picture. It was drawn from the life. As soon as the first shock of his irresistible fright had subsided, Dennis Toone stole a look at his hosts. The sacristan's hands were pressed upon his eyes. His daughter, looking up at the cross on the wall, was telling her beads feverishly. At last the question was asked. "Is this book for sale?" There was the same hesitation, the same plunge of determination that he had noticed before, and then came the welcome answer. "If monsieur pleases." "How much do you ask for it?" "I will take 250 francs. This was confounding. Even a collector's conscience is sometimes stirred, and Dennis Toon's conscience was tenderer than a collector's. "My good man," he said again and again, "your book is worth far more than 250 francs, I assure you, far more." But the answer did not vary. "I will take 250 francs, not more." There was really no possibility of refusing such a chance. The money was paid, the receipt signed, a glass of wine drunk over the transaction. And then the sacristan seemed to become a new man. He stood upright. He ceased to throw those suspicious glances behind him. He actually laughed, or tried to laugh. Dennis Toon rose to go. "I shall have the honour of accompanying monsieur to his hotel," said the sacristan. "Oh, no, thanks. It isn't 100 yards. I know the way perfectly, and there's a moon." The offer was pressed 3 or 4 times, and refused as often. "Then monsieur will summon me if he finds occasion. He will keep the middle of the road. The sides are so rough." Certainly, said Dennis Toon, who was impatient to examine his prize by himself, and he stepped out into the passage with his book under his arm. Here he was met by the daughter. She, it appeared, was anxious to do a little business on her own account, perhaps, like Gehazi, to take somewhat from the foreigner whom her father had spared. "A silver crucifix and chain for the neck? Monsieur would perhaps be good enough to accept it?" Well, really, Dennis Toon hadn't much use for these things. What did mademoiselle want for it? Nothing in the world. Monsieur is more than welcome to it. The tone in which this and much more was said was unmistakably genuine, so that Dennis Toon was reduced to profuse thanks, and submitted to have the chain put around his neck. It really seemed as if he had rendered the father and daughter some service which they hardly knew how to repay. As he set off with his book, they stood at the door looking after him, and they were still looking when he waved them a last good night from the steps of the Chapeau Rouge. Dinner was over, and Dennis Toon was in his bedroom, shut up alone with his acquisition. The landlady had manifested a particular interest in him since he had told her that he had paid a visit to the sacristan and bought an old book from him. He thought, too, that he had heard a hurried dialogue between her and the said sacristan in the passage outside the salle à manger. Some words to the effect that Pierre and Bertrand would be sleeping in the house had closed the conversation. All this time, a growing feeling of discomfort had been creeping over him. Nervous reaction, perhaps, after the delight of his discovery. Whatever it was, it resulted in a conviction that there was someone behind him, and that he was far more comfortable with his back to the wall. All this, of course, weighed light in the balance as against the obvious value of the collection he had acquired. And now, as I said, he was alone in his bedroom, taking stock of Canon Alberic's treasures, in which every moment revealed something more charming. "Bless Canon Alberic," said Dennis Toon, who had an inveterate habit of talking to himself. "I wonder where he is now. Dear me, I wish that landlady would learn to laugh in a more cheering manner. It makes one feel as if there was someone dead in the house. Half a pipe more, did you say? I think perhaps you're right. I wonder what that crucifix is that the young woman insisted on giving me. Last century, I suppose. Yes, probably. It is rather a nuisance of a thing to have around one's neck, just too heavy. Most likely her father has been wearing it for years. I think I might give it a clean up before I put it away." He had taken the crucifix off and laid it on the table when his attention was caught by an object lying on the red cloth just by his left elbow. 2 or 3 ideas of what it might be flitted through his brain with their own incalculable quickness. A pen wiper? No such thing in the house. A rat? No. Too black. A large spider? I trust to goodness not. No. Good God! A hand like the hand in that picture! In another infinitesimal flash he had taken it in. Pale, dusky skin covering nothing but bones and tendons of appalling strength, coarse black hairs longer than ever grew on a human hand, nails rising from the ends of the fingers and curving sharply down and forward, grey, horny, and wrinkled. He flew out of his chair with deadly, inconceivable terror clutching at his heart. The shape, whose left hand rested on the table, was rising to a standing posture behind his seat, its right hand crooked above his scalp. There was black and tattered drapery about it. The coarse hair covered it, as in the drawing. The lower jaw was thin. What can I call it? Shallow, like a beast's. Teeth showed behind the black lips. There was no nose. The eyes of a fiery yellow, against which the pupils showed black and intense, and the exulting hate and thirst to destroy life which shone there, were the most horrifying features in the whole vision. There was intelligence of a kind in them. Intelligence beyond that of a beast, below that of a man. The feelings which this horror stirred in Dennis Toon were the intensest physical fear and the most profound mental loathing. What did he do? What could he do? He has never been quite certain what words he said, but he knows that he spoke, that he grasped blindly at the silver crucifix, that he was conscious of a movement towards him on the part of the demon, and that he screamed with the voice of an animal in hideous pain. Pierre and Bertrand, the two sturdy little serving-men who rushed in, saw nothing, but felt themselves thrust aside by something that passed out between them, and found Dennis Toon in a swoon. They sat up with him that night, and his two friends were in St. Bertrand by 9 o'clock the next morning. He himself, though still shaken and nervous, was almost himself by that time, and his story found credence with them, though not until they had seen the drawing and talked with the sacristan. Almost at dawn, the little man had come to the inn on some pretence, and had listened with the deepest interest to the story retailed by the landlady. He showed no surprise. "It is he! It is he! I have seen him myself," was his only comment, and to all questionings but one reply was vouchsafed. "Deux fois je l'ai vu, mille fois je l'ai senti." If you don't speak French, that's twice, well, if you don't understand my French, twice I have seen him, 1,000 times I have felt him. He would tell them nothing of the provenance of the book, nor any details of his experiences. "I shall soon sleep, and my rest will be sweet. Why should you trouble me?" he said. He died that summer. His daughter married and settled at Sampapoul. She never understood the circumstances of her father's obsession. We shall never know what he or Canon Alberic de Meulion suffered. At the back of that fateful drawing were some lines of writing which may be supposed to throw light on the situation. Contradictio Salomonis cum demonio nocturno, Albericus de Mauleone delineavit. Videus in adiutorium Psalms, qui habitat. Sancte Bertrande, demoniorum effugator, intercede pro me miserrimo. Primum vidi nocte 12 December 1694, videbo mox ultimum, peccavi et passus sum, plura ad hoc passurus, December 29, 1701. Which translates to The Dispute of Solomon with the Demon of the Night, drawn by Alberic de Meulion. Versicle. O Lord, make haste to help me. Psalm, whoso dwelleth. St. Bertrand, who put his devils to flight, pray for me most unhappy. I saw it first on the night of December the 12th, 1694. Soon I shall see it for the last time. I have sinned and suffered and have more to suffer yet. December 29th, 1701. The Gallia Christiana gives the date of the Canon Alberic's death as December the 31st, 1701, in bed of a sudden seizure. Details of this kind are not common in the great work of the Samathani. I have never quite understood what was Dennis Toon's view of the events I have narrated. He quoted to me once a text from Ecclesiasticus. Some spirits there be that are created for vengeance, and in their fury lay on sore strokes. On another occasion he said, Isaiah was a very sensible man. Doesn't he say something about night monsters living in the ruins of Babylon? These things are rather beyond us at present. Another confidence of his impressed me rather, and I sympathized with it. We had been last year to Camanche to see Canon Alberic's tomb. It is a great marble erection with an effigy of the canon in a large wig and soutane and an elaborate eulogy of his learning below. I saw Dennis Toon talking for some time with the vicar of St. Bertrand's. And as we drove away, he said to me, "I hope it isn't wrong. You know, I am a Presbyterian, but I believe there will be a saying of Mass and singing of dirges for Alberic de Mauleon's rest." Then he added, with a touch of the Northern British in his tone, "I had no notion they came so dear." The book is in the Wentworth collection at Cambridge. The drawing was photographed and then burnt by Dennis Toon on the day when he left Camargue on the occasion of his first visit. I can only apologise for my French accent. But I hope you enjoyed that. The awkward thing where there's the delay in the stream, so I'm kind of left with that crime guy giggling at the marble erection. I thought as I read it that might create some sniggers. Susan, I said sniggers. So, yeah. I can read the next one if people would like. Might shake my arm off. This book is quite heavy. And pour myself a second glass of port. I kind of considered the trouble with, not trouble, one of the sort of nice and challenging things about, I suppose, Emma James's work is that because he was such an academic and so knowledgeable, and so many of his characters are, so many of his characters are sort of academics in the kind of field that he was in. It's quite self-referential. I think there were probably quite a few in-jokes in there about sort of certain collectors or academics that kind of are likely to just go over our heads, because he was writing these mainly as a sort of Christmas Eve entertainment for his colleagues and his friends, as I said at the start. So it was very much just something that stories that he would tell to an in crowd. So I think probably there's a certain amount of kind of academic commentary there that we're sort of missing out on. So I was kind of considering whether or not to start each story by going over, oh, you'll hear them reference this and that's what it means, and he'll say this and that's what that means. But I kind of decided that would get a bit tedious and kind of a bit overlong and over elaborate. So hopefully that kind of letting it just flow over all of us was fine. Gatsby seems to be upstairs and relatively quiet. I think because Proper Horror Show's the real one he loves of the two of us. If he's near her, then he'll probably be okay. Yeah, if he's on Proper Horror Show's lap, then there won't be any swearing or other commentary from Gatsby. Right. This one is... This is the first one I was considering reading to everyone, because it's quite a nice kind of quietly creepy story. But because it opens with a reference to Dennis Toon, and the name is spelt Dennis Toun, so I've done my best with the pronunciation. It's I sort of thought, well, it's referencing that other story. I might as well read that one too. So that was kind of why I started with Canon Alberic's scrapbook. But the tone of this one is quite different. I will, having just rambled on and said, I won't bother explaining stuff, I will explain a couple of things here. So it's called the mezzotint, which is essentially a kind of engraving technique. I'll see if I can find... a note that explains what it is precisely, because that will probably help a bit. It feels like it's one of those things that if you don't know what it is, then the rest of the story is going to feel a bit confusing. Right. So mezzotint is a method of engraving on copper or steel, in which the surface of the plate is first roughened uniformly, the lights and half-lights being then produced by scraping away the nap thus formed, and the untouched parts giving the deepest shadows. So it's very kind of black and white engraving technique. Mr. GB does sound a bit Geordie, I'll be honest with you. But it's all one word, Dennis Toon. The other thing is that there's a certain amount of academic Oxbridgey sniggering. So lots of references to the other place, or another university, which means Oxford, if you're not a Brit or aren't aware of that particular rivalry. Oxford and Cambridge can't stand each other because Oxford's clearly inferior. Sorry, I can't help it. It's part of the degree. And yeah, there'll be a few references to things like, the time for going to hall, or sort of particular language they have. They talk about a scout, having scouts, which are basically your kind of cleaners, porters, sort of attendants within Oxbridge colleges. Well, Oxford colleges have scouts. Cambridge has something that Susan would not let me say on air. And then, what was the other thing I just spotted that I will explain and have now lost? Oh no, it's not a scout, it's a skip. No, I can't find the thing I was thinking of. So if we get to the end of the story and you're all confused, I'll try and explain whatever it was if I remember. But now I need to recreate the atmosphere. So this is called the mezzotint. Some time ago, I believe I had the pleasure of telling you the story of an adventure which happened to a friend of mine by the name of Dennis Toon during his pursuit of objects of art for the Museum of Cambridge. He did not publish his experiences very widely upon his return to England, but they could not fail to become known to a good many of his friends, and among others to the gentleman who at that time presided over an art museum at another university. It was to be expected that the story should make a considerable impression on the mind of a man whose vocation lay in lines similar to Dennis Toon's, and that he should be eager to catch at any explanation of the matter which tended to make it seem improbable that he should ever be called upon to deal with so agitating an emergency. It was indeed somewhat consoling to him to reflect that he was not expected to acquire ancient manuscripts for his institution. That was the business of the Shelburnian Library. The authorities of that might, if they pleased, ransack obscure corners of the continent for such matters. He was glad to be obliged at the moment to confine his attention to enlarging the already unsurpassed collection of English topographical drawings and engravings possessed by his museum. Yet, as it turned out, even a department so homely and familiar as this may have its dark corners, and to one of these, Mr. Williams was unexpectedly introduced. Those who have taken even the most limited interest in the acquisition of topographical pictures are aware that there is one London dealer whose aid is indispensable to their researches. Mr. J. W. Britnell publishes, at short intervals, very admirable catalogues of a large and constantly changing stock of engravings, plans, and old sketches of mansions, churches, and towns in England and Wales. These catalogues were, of course, the ABC of his subject to Mr. Williams. But as his museum already contained an enormous accumulation of topographical pictures, he was a regular rather than a copious buyer, and he rather looked to Mr. Britnell to fill up gaps in the rank and file of his collection than to supply him with rarities. Now, in February of last year, there appeared upon Mr. Williams's desk at the museum a catalogue from Mr. Britnell's emporium, and accompanying it was a typewritten communication from the dealer himself. This letter ran as follows. Dear Sir, we beg to call your attention to number 978 in our accompanying catalogue, which we shall be glad to send on approval. Yours faithfully, J. W. Britnell. To turn to number 978 in the accompanying catalogue was, with Mr. Williams, as he observed to himself, the work of a moment, and in the place indicated he found the following entry. 978. Unknown. Interesting mezzotint. View of a manor house, early part of the century. 15 by 10 inches, black frame, £2, 2s. It was not specially exciting, and the price seemed high. However, as Mr. Britnell, who knew his business and his customer, seemed to set store by it, Mr. Williams wrote a postcard asking for the article to be sent on approval, along with some other engravings and sketches which appeared in the same catalogue. And so he passed, without much excitement of anticipation, to the ordinary labours of the day. A parcel of any kind always arrives a day later than you expected, and that of Mr. Britnell proved, as I believe the right phrase goes, no exception to the rule. It was delivered at the museum by the afternoon post of Saturday, after Mr. Williams had left his work, and it was accordingly brought round to his rooms in college by the attendant, in order that he might not have to wait over Sunday before looking through it, and returning such of the contents as he did not propose to keep. And here he found it when he came into tea with a friend. The only item with which I am concerned was the rather large, black-framed mezzotint, of which I have already quoted the short description given in Mr. Britnell's catalogue. Some more details of it will have to be given, though I cannot hope to put before you the look of the picture as clearly as it is present to my own eye. Very nearly the exact duplicate of it may be seen in a good many old inn parlours, or in the passages of undisturbed country mansions at the present moment. It was a rather indifferent mezzotint, and an indifferent mezzotint is perhaps the worst form of engraving known. It presented a full-face view of a not very large manor house of the last century, with 3 rows of plain sashed windows with rusticated masonry about them, a parapet with balls or vases at the angles, and a small portico in the centre. On either side were trees, and in front a considerable expanse of lawn. The legend AWF Sculpsit was engraved on the narrow margin, and there were no further inscriptions. The whole thing gave the impression that it was the work of an amateur. What in the world Mr. Britnell could mean by affixing the price of £2 2 shillings to such an object was more than Mr. Williams could imagine. He turned it over with a good deal of contempt. Upon the back was a paper label, the left-hand half of which had been torn off. All that remained were the ends of 2 lines of writing. The first had the letters Ungley Hall, the second Sex. It would perhaps be just worthwhile to identify the place represented, which he could easily do with the help of a gazetteer, and then he would send it back to Mr. Britnell with some remarks reflecting upon the judgment of that gentleman. He lighted the candles, for it was now dark, made the tea, and supplied the friend with whom he had been playing golf, for I believe the authorities of the university I write of indulge in that pursuit by way of relaxation. And tea was taken to the accompaniment of a discussion which golfing persons can imagine for themselves, but which the conscientious writer has no right to inflict upon any non-golfing persons. The conclusion arrived at was that certain strokes might have been better, and that in certain emergencies neither player had experienced that amount of luck which a human being has a right to expect. It was now that the friend, let us call him Professor Binks, took up the framed engraving and said, "What's this place, Williams?" "Just what I'm going to try and find out," said Williams, going to the shelf for a gazetteer. "Look at the back. Somethingly Hall, either in Sussex or Essex. Half the name's gone, you see." "You don't happen to know it, I suppose?" "It's from that man Britnell, I suppose, isn't it?" said Binks. "Is it for the museum?" "Well, I think I should buy it if the price was 5 shillings, said Williams. "But for some unearthly reason he wants 2 guineas for it. I can't conceive why. It's a wretched engraving, and there aren't even any figures to give it life." "It's not worth 2 guineas, I should think," said Binks, "but I don't think it's so badly done. The moonlight seems rather good to me, and I should have thought there were figures, or at least a figure, just on the edge, in front." "Let's look," said Williams. "Well, yeah, it's true that the light is rather cleverly given. Where's your figure?" Oh, yes, just the head, in the very front of the picture." And indeed there was, hardly more than a black blot on the extreme edge of the engraving. The head of a man or a woman, a good deal muffled up, the back turned to the spectator and looking towards the house. Williams had not noticed it before. "Still," he said, "though it's a cleverer thing than I thought, I can't spend 2 guineas of museum money on a picture of a place I don't know." Professor Binks had his work to do, and soon went, and very nearly up to hall time, Williams was engaged in a vain attempt to identify the subject of his picture. If the vowel before the had only been left, it would have been easy enough, he thought. But as it is, the name may be anything from Guestingley to Langley, and there are many more names ending like this than I thought, and this rotten book has no index of terminations. Hall in Mr. Williams's college was at 7. It need not be dwelt upon, the less so as he met their colleagues who had been playing golf during the afternoon, and words with which we have no concern were freely bandied across the table. Merely golfing words, I hasten to explain. I suppose an hour or more to have been spent in what is called common room after dinner. Later in the evening, some few retired to Williams's rooms, and I have little doubt that whist was played and tobacco smoked. During a lull in these operations, Williams picked up the mezzotint from the table without looking at it, and handed it to a person mildly interested in art, telling him where it had come from and the other particulars which we already know. The gentleman took it carelessly, looked at it, then said in a tone of some interest, "It's really a very good piece of work, Williams. It has quite a feeling of the romantic period. The light is admirably managed, it seems to me, and the figure, though it's rather too grotesque, is somehow very impressive." "Yes, isn't it?" said Williams, who was just then busy giving whisky and soda to others of the company, and was unable to come across the room to look at the view again. It was by this time rather late in the evening, and the visitors were on the move. After they went, Williams was obliged to write a letter or two and clear up some odd bits of work. At last, some time past midnight, he was disposed to turn in, and he put out his lamp after lighting his bedroom candle. The picture lay face upwards on the table where the last man who looked at it had put it, and it caught his eye as he turned the lamp down. What he saw made him very nearly drop the candle on the floor, and he declares now that if he had been left in the dark at that moment he would have had a fit. But, as that did not happen, he was able to put down the light on the table and take a good look at the picture. It was indubitable, rankly impossible, no doubt, but absolutely certain. In the middle of the lawn, in front of the unknown house, there was a figure where no figure had been at 5 o'clock that afternoon. It was crawling on all fours towards the house, and it was muffled in a strange black garment with a white cross on the back. I do not know what is the ideal course to pursue in a situation of this kind. I can only tell you what Mr. Williams did. He took the picture by one corner and carried it across the passage to a second set of rooms which he possessed. There he locked it up in a drawer, sported the doors of both sets of rooms, and retired to bed. But first he wrote out and signed an account of the extraordinary change which the picture had undergone since it had come into his possession. Sleep visited him rather late, but it was consoling to reflect that the behaviour of the picture did not depend on his own unsupported testimony. Evidently the man who had looked at it the night before had seen something of the same kind as he had. Otherwise he might have been tempted to think that something gravely wrong was happening either to his eyes or his mind. This possibility being fortunately precluded, 2 matters awaited him on the morrow. He must take stock of the picture very carefully and call in a witness for the purpose, and he must make a determined effort to ascertain what house it was that was represented. He would therefore ask his neighbour Nisbet to breakfast with him, and he would subsequently spend a morning over the gazetteer. Nisbet was disengaged, and arrived about 9:30. His host was not quite dressed, I am sorry to say, even at this late hour. During breakfast, nothing was said about the mezzotint by Williams, save that he had a picture on which he wished for Nisbet's opinion. But those who are familiar with university life can picture for themselves the wide and delightful range of subjects over which the conversation of the 2 fellows of Canterbury College is likely to extend during a Sunday morning breakfast. Hardly a topic was left unchallenged, from golf to lawn tennis. Yet I am bound to say that Williams was rather distraught, for his interest naturally centred in that very strange picture which was now reposing, face downwards, in the drawer in the room opposite. The morning pipe was at last lighted, and the moment had arrived for which he looked. With very considerable, almost tremulous excitement, he ran across, unlocked the drawer, and, extracting the picture, still face downwards, ran back and put it into Nisbet's hands. "Now," he said, "Nisbet, I want you to tell me exactly what you see in that picture. Describe it, if you don't mind, rather minutely. I'll tell you why afterwards." "Well," said Nisbet, I have here a view of a country house, English, I presume, by moonlight. Moonlight? You're sure of that? Certainly. The moon appears to be on the wane, if you wish for details, and there are clouds in the sky. All right, go on. I'll swear, added Williams in an aside, there was no moon when I saw it first. Well, there's not much more to be said, Nisbet continued. The house has 1, 2, 3 rows of windows, 5 in each row, except at the bottom, where there's a porch instead of the middle one. And, but what about figures? Said Williams, with marked interest. There aren't any, said Nisbet. But what? No figure on the grass in front? Not a thing. You'll swear to that? Certainly I will. Well, there's just one other thing. What? Why, one of the windows on the ground floor, left of the door, is open. Is it really? My goodness. He must have got in, said Williams, with great excitement, and he hurried to the back of the sofa on which Nisbet was sitting, and catching the picture from him, verified the matter for himself. It was quite true. There was no figure, and there was the open window. Williams, after a moment of speechless surprise, went to the writing table and scribbled for a short time. Then he brought 2 papers to Nisbet and asked him first to sign one. It was his own description of the picture, which you have just heard, and then to read the other, which was Williams's statement written the night before. What can it all mean? Said Nisbet. Exactly, said Williams. Well, one thing I must do, or 3 things, now I think of it. I must find out from Garwood, this was his last night's visitor, what he saw, and then I must get the thing photographed before it goes further. And then I must find out what that place is. I can do the photographing myself, said Nisbet, and I will. But, it looks very much as if we were assisting at the working out of a tragedy somewhere. The question is, has it happened already, or is it going to come off? You must find out what that place is. Yes, he said, looking at the picture again. I expect you're right. He has got in. And if I don't mistake, there'll be the devil to pay in one of the rooms upstairs. I'll tell you what, said Williams. I'll take the picture across to old Green. This was the senior fellow of the college, who had been bursar for many years. It's quite likely he'll know it. We have property in Essex and Sussex, and he must have been over the 2 counties quite a lot in his time. Quite likely he will, said Nisbet. But just let me take my photograph first. But look here, I rather think Green isn't up today. He wasn't in hall last night, and I think I heard him say he was going down for the Sunday. That's true too, said Williams. I know he's gone to Brighton. Well, if you'll photograph it now, I'll go across to Garwood and get his statement, and you keep an eye on it while I'm gone. I'm beginning to think 2 guineas is not a very exorbitant price for it now. In a short time he had returned and brought Mr. Garwood with him. Garwood's statement was to the effect that the figure, when he had seen it, was clear of the edge of the picture, but had not got far across the lawn. He remembered a white mark on the back of its drapery, but could not have been sure it was a cross. A document to this effect was then drawn up and signed, and Nisbet proceeded to photograph the picture. Now, what do you mean to do? He said. Are you going to sit and watch it all day? Well, no, I think not, said Williams. I rather imagine we're meant to see the whole thing. You see, between the time I saw it last night and this morning, there was time for lots of things to happen. But the creature only got into the house. It could easily have got through its business in the time and gone to its own place again, but the fact of the window being open, I think, must mean that it's in there now. So I feel quite easy about leaving it. And besides, I have a kind of idea that it wouldn't change much, if at all, in the daytime. We might go out for a walk this afternoon, and come in to tea, or whenever it gets dark. I shall leave it out on the table here, and sport the door. My skip can get in, but no one else. The 3 agreed that this would be a good plan, and further, that if they spent the afternoon together, they would be less likely to talk about the business to other people, for any rumour of such a transaction as were going on would bring the whole of the Phasmatological Society about their ears. We may give them a respite until 5 o'clock. At, or near that hour, the 3 were entering Williams's staircase. They were at first slightly annoyed to see that the door of his rooms was unsported, but in a moment it was remembered that on Sunday the skips came in for orders an hour or so earlier than on weekdays. However, a surprise was awaiting them. The first thing they saw was the picture leaning up against a pile of books on the table, as it had been left, and the next thing was Williams's Skip, seated on a chair opposite, gazing at it with undisguised horror. How was this? Mr. Filcher, the name is not my own invention, was a servant of considerable standing, and set the standard of etiquette to all his own college and to several neighbouring ones, and nothing could be more alien to his practice than to be found sitting on his master's chair, or appearing to take any particular notice of his master's furniture or pictures. Indeed, he seemed to feel this himself. He started violently when the three men came into the room, and got up with a marked effort. Then he said, "I ask your pardon, sir, for taking such a freedom as to set down." "Not at all, Robert," interposed Mr. Williams. "I was meaning to ask you some time what you thought of that picture." "Well, sir, of course I don't set up my opinion against yours, but it ain't the picture I should hang where my little girl could see it, sir." "Wouldn't you, Robert? Why not?" "No, sir. Why, the poor child, I recollect once she saw a door Bible with pictures not half what that is, and we had to set up with her 3 or 4 nights afterwards, if you'll believe me. And if she was to catch sight of this here skeleton here, or whatever it is, carrying off the poor baby, she would be in a taking. You know how it is with children, how nervous they get with a little thing and all. But what I should say, it don't seem a right picture to be laying about, sir. Not where anyone that's liable to be startled could come on it. Should you be wanting anything this evening, sir?" "Thank you, sir." With these words, the excellent man went to continue the round of his masters, and you may be sure the gentleman whom he left lost no time in gathering around the engraving. There was the house, as before, under the waning moon and the drifting clouds. The window that had been open was shut, and the figure was once more on the lawn, but not this time crawling cautiously on hands and knees. Now it was erect and stepping swiftly, with long strides, towards the front of the picture. The moon was behind it, and the black drapery hung down over its face, so that only hints of that could be seen, and what was visible made the spectators profoundly thankful that they could see no more than a white dome-like forehead and a few straggling hairs. The head was bent down, and the arms were tightly clasped over an object which could be dimly seen and identified as a child. Whether dead or living, it was not possible to say. The legs of the appearance alone could be plainly discerned, and they were horribly thin. From 5 to 7, the three companions sat and watched the picture by turns, but it never changed. They agreed at last that it would be safe to leave it, and they would return after hall and await further developments. When they assembled again at the earliest possible moment, the engraving was there, but the figure was gone, and the house was quiet under the moonbeams. There was nothing for it but to spend the evening over gazetteers and guidebooks. Williams was the lucky one at last, and perhaps he deserved it. At 11:30 p.m. he read from Murray's Guide to Essex the following lines. 16.5 miles, Anningley. The church has been an interesting building of Norman date, but was extensively classicised in the last century. It contains the tombs of the family of Francis, whose mansion, Anningley Hall, a solid Queen Anne house, stands immediately beyond the churchyard in a park of about 80 acres. The family is now extinct, the last heir having disappeared mysteriously in infancy in the year 1802. The father, Mr. Arthur Francis, was locally known as a talented amateur engraver in mezzotint. After his son's disappearance, he lived in complete retirement at the Hall, and was found dead in his studio on the 3rd anniversary of the disaster, having just completed an engraving of the house, impressions of which are of considerable rarity. This looked like business, and indeed Mr. Green, on his return, at once identified the house as Anningley Hall. "Is there any kind of explanation of the figure, Green?" was the question which Williams naturally asked. "I don't know, I'm sure, Williams. What used to be said in the place when I first knew it, which was before I came up here, was just this. Old Francis was always very much down on these poaching fellows, and whenever he got a chance he used to get a man whom he suspected of it turned off the estate, and by degrees he got rid of them all but one. Squires could do a lot of things then that they daren't think of now. Well, this man that was left was what you find pretty often in that country, the last remains of a very old family. I believe they were lords of the manor at one time. I recollect just the same thing in my own parish. What, like the man in Tess of the D'Urbervilles? Williams put in. Yes, I dare say. It's not a book I could ever read myself. But this fellow could show a row of tombs in the church there that belonged to his ancestors, and all that went to sour him a bit. But Francis, they said, could never get at him. He always kept just on the right side of the law, until one night the keepers found him at it in a wood right by the end of the estate. I could show you the place now. It marches with some land that used to belong to an uncle of mine. And you can imagine there was a row, and this man, Gaudy, that was the name. To be sure, Gaudy. I thought I should get it. Gaudy. He was unlucky enough, poor chap, to shoot a keeper. Well, that was what Francis wanted, and grand juries, you know what they would have been then, and poor Gaudy was strung up in double quick time. And I've been shown the place he was buried in, on the north side of the church. You know the way in that part of the world. Anyone that's been hanged or made away with themselves, they bury them that side. And the idea was that some friend of Gaudy's, not a relation because he had none, poor devil, he was the last of his line, kind of spes ultima gentis, must have planned to get hold of Francis's boy and put an end to his line too. I don't know, it's rather an out-of-the-way thing for an Essex poacher to think of, but, you know, I should say now, it looks more as if old Gaudy had managed the job himself. Ooh, I hate to think of it. Have some whiskey, Williams. The facts were communicated by Williams to Dennis Toon, and by him to a mixed company, of which I was one, and the Sadducean professor of archaeology another. I am sorry to say that the latter, when asked what he thought of it, only remarked, "Oh, those Bridgeford people will say anything," a sentiment which met with the reception it deserved. I have only to add that the picture is now in the Ashleyan Museum, and that it has been treated with a view to discovering whether sympathetic ink has been used in it, but without effect. The Mr. Britnell knew nothing of it, save that he was sure it was uncommon, and that, though carefully watched, it has never been known to change again. Well, thank you, everyone. I hope you enjoyed that. I have the slightly awkward thing now of dealing with the delay while hopefully chat catches up. But yes, I remembered the thing I was going to say, which was the reference to the Phasmatological Society is a bit of a dig at one of James's academic rivals. I briefly mentioned him earlier. He was a chap called Sidgwick, who was a sort of quite well-known academic in Cambridge at the time. He was very heavily involved in the effort to open Cambridge degrees up to women, although he'd probably regret some choices now. Where is it? Yes, so Sidgwick was one of the founders of Newnham College, and was kind of very involved in sort of trying to open up more access to Cambridge for women. But he was also the founder of the Society for Psychical Research, I believe. So it's weird that he's the sort of main humanities site at Cambridge is named after him. It's the Sidgwick site, and yet he's also sort of out there leading a society researching ghosts and ghoulies and that sort of thing. So that's a nice little nugget. That's what that reference was to. But yes, I don't quite know how to finish this, other than I hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like more ghost stories over the Christmas period, then I guess let Proper Horror Show know, and we can do some more. There's a very creepy one that's definitely not about adrenochrome. So I could read that if you'd like. And I will give it a couple of seconds because I sort of want to see the reaction to that comment, and then I'll sign off, I guess. But yes, Proper Horror Show, the dig at Oxford was very funny. I think there's probably a lot more academic infighting. Oh, yeah, that's another thing to mention. Probably a lot more academic infighting and sort of sniggering and backbiting than we picked up on, but definitely it's one of those kinds of writers where he likes to make a point of digging at Oxford, because that's what we have to do. I'll close off by saying that A, we could do more ghost stories, and B, Proper Horror Show's Christmas special comes out tomorrow, probably around the same time of night, or morning if you're not in the UK. So I hope I'll see some of you in the chat for that, because Proper Horror Show will be putting it out as as a premiere, and that'll be lovely. I'm rambling. See you tomorrow for the Christmas special. I'm going to shut up now. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed yourselves.